where I lived down Downside Drive, the house was built. The house was a new house. It had been built in maybe 1938, and it was actually quite modern in the sense that it had a back boiler which allowed you to have hot water on tap the whole time from the boiler. It also had an oven attached to the back of the fire, so you could actually use it for baking then, but people preferred gas ovens. The road I lived in was quite a nice road. It probably had about 50 or so houses, and there was quite a lot of children there, and we tended to, after school, run in a pack. We'd all been to St John's School, which was about half a mile up the road, and then we used to, at the evening, we used to play cricket on the grounds. Some children were much better off than others, and there was one particular boy who was very, very fortunate in the sense that when Don Bradman was very popular, he had a Don Bradman's hat, he had a Don Bradman's pullover, he had wicket pads, he had a box, he had 4 stumps, he had 2 sets of ales, and he had a smashing bat, and he had a genuine cricket ball. And so if we wanted to play cricket, we had to go and knock on his door asking did he want to play cricket. Usually it was okay, and he'd come out with all this stuff, and we used to look on in envy, and then he would set all the stumps up and the wickets and put the bails on and all the rest of it. But the rule was that he always had the first bat, and there was another unwritten rule: he had to be put out in the first bat. He'd have at least 8 or 9 goes at running before he was out. And I can remember one unfortunate incident where the bowler got a little bit over enthusiastic, and he threw the ball with vigour, and it was straight into the wickets. The bails flew, and he immediately started pulling the stumps up, muttering and shouting, and he took his ball back, and then he left us in the field, and we all then harassed the bowler for putting him out at the first ball, and we'd explain to him that you didn't put him out on the first ball, and that situation went on for at least 2 years that I can remember. But nevertheless, we were happy that we played, and we also used to go borrowing apples and pears from the farmer down the road, which seemed to upset him at times. And I can remember one instance when maybe 20 of us went into the orchard in August time, August, September, and there were some pear trees and there were some apple trees. And pear trees are very, very tall trees, and they say you plant pears for heirs because they take a long time to grow, but they're a very tall tree. And we went into this orchard, and there were pear trees and apple trees, and I fancied some pear, and I managed to get up this pear tree quite high off the ground, because I wanted to keep away from the other children, because I knew if the farmer came, as often he did do, if the farmer came, then he'd catch me. So I went into the tree, and just as I got to the very close to the top, I saw the farmer coming down the lane. Being the type of person I am, I said nothing. I just hung onto the tree, and he came in shouting, and he caught about 7 of them. Because when he shouted them to come, children were very obedient in those days. They stood still. And then the policeman came. Well, the policeman came, I saw him come, and he took them away. I think he went to the houses then. And then when the farmer had gone, I came down the tree, and a lot of the children had left their apples and pears, and I collected as many as I could and went home with them. And I got in trouble off my mother, pinching pears. The policeman who'd come was a Sergeant Pollitt. Have I gone through this before? Oh. The policeman who came was a Sergeant Pollitt. Now, Sergeant Pollitt was a very impressive policeman. He was well over 6 foot, quite well built, and he rode what we call a sit-up-and-beg bike, which is similar to a woman's bike. It didn't have a crossbar. And this bike was very old, and it had a lamp on the front, which didn't shine much light, and when he pedalled it, it creaked. It always reminded us of the crocodile in Peter Pan. And often at nights when we were up to mischief, and knock-a-door was a common game we played, you could sometimes, when it was quiet because there was no cars around, you could hear the creak. And when we heard that creak, we knew Sergeant Pollock was on his way, and we were terrified of him. It didn't seem to matter, wherever we went, he always managed to catch at least one of us, who was then taken back to the parents, and he worked his way around a lot, and he'd got very good control, and he had 2 other policemen who were his assistants. And the main police station and magistrates' court was in Chapel Brow, just close to Leyland Station. Because I was disabled, the ladies round the road often used to speak to my mother and say he's going to have to get a job, some type of job where he doesn't have to walk around. And they used to talk as if I wasn't there. And my mother didn't know what to do, and she took on hand, because these ladies were, the neighbours were trying to be very helpful. There was a lady called Mrs. Leyland who taught the piano for £0.50 an hour. She said she'd teach me for half price. And I used to go to Mrs. Leyland, and she worked hard on me. But she was over sympathetic towards me. And we usually started off, she'd take me to the piano stool to do some scales. And I usually said, my leg's hurting me, I need another chair to put it on. So she then put a chair beside it so I could put my leg on it. I then said, well, I really need it moving. And we went through this game for around about 20 minutes. And it went on for a period of about 3 or 4 months, and then she gave up. But my mother used to supplement what Mrs. Leyland told me by teaching the piano to me herself. And it was quite interesting, because she used to stand behind me and wait for me to play a wrong note and clip me at the back of the ear. Mrs. Leyland gave up this teaching me, and I went to another who was a teacher, and she only had me for 2 or 3 months, and she gave up as well. But the idea was that I would learn to play the piano, and in the public houses in those days there was always a pianist, and he had what you could call a honky-tonk piano. It was never in tune, but he used to go in and play the piano for no money, and then people used to put money in a jug on the top of the piano, and he also bought him pints of beer. And it was quite a good existence, because you could go at night into the pub, play the piano, you get some money, and you could also get free beer. But I never fancied that, doing anything like that. I really wanted to do something more, but they didn't think I had any ability to do anything beyond that. As I said before, in 1945, my dad was released after serving 2.5 years as a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp. And he came back to our house in 62, Rancher Drive. He had round about 4 months rehabilitation, where he was trying to build weight on his body, and he did a lot of exercise. But he was very agitated and bothered and disturbed with his experience. He then went back, and he was given the option of either retiring from the army or going on further, and he decided to stay with the army, which needed him to move to Aldershot. When they first got married, they were given barroom accommodation, family accommodation, and they were supposed to be doing the same again. But when my mother went down to, and they sold the house in Rancher Drive, and it was arranged that they would move to Aldershot, to accommodation close to that, while my dad got a posting somewhere. But when my mother went, she was very upset. She didn't like it at all. Gillian had been born, and she thought about it and decided she wouldn't go, but they sold Rancher Drive. And then while my dad was still in the army. He'd gone to the army then for his, not his national, but to actually be sort of job, because his main skill was in explosive. He spent a lot of time with shells and explosive and various types of ordnance, and he was staying with that, and she was wondering what to do, and she didn't want to take us all to London again, and she didn't want barrack accommodation and moving around, and I'm assuming with my father's permission, bought a house in Preston. And then when I was 13, it would be probably 1948, we all moved to Preston, and there was my mum, Peter, me and my sister was just a baby then. It was necessary to find a new school, and Peter to find a new school. Peter went to Preston Grammar School because he'd already been going to Balshers Grammar School, which is the same school Dorothy went to. And they found a school for me at St Mark's, and it probably was one of the lucky places, because the school was a very old-fashioned school, but it was a happy school. But there was a man there called Mr Waddington, who was the headmaster, and he had an interest in science. And due to various conversations in class, he found out I was interested in astronomy. With my father's recovery, he decided to stay in the army, which needed him to move to the Aldershot area. His specialty was in ordnance and explosives. Arrangements had been made for us to move all the family into army accommodation, but they didn't know where it would be, because it depended on where my father's posting would be, and he'd actually spent a lot of time at the factory in Leyland. That was one of the biggest ordnance factories in the northwest. But he went back, and my mother went, and they'd already decided to dispose of the house. And I'm not sure whether it was, I think it was a rented house. I think they were giving up the rent. And when my mother went there, she said she wasn't going, and she came back without my father and said that we were going to go somewhere else, and they actually ended up buying a house in Fire Road, Preston, 207 Fire Road, Preston, which isn't in existence now. It's been knocked down. And my mother and my brother and my baby sister, myself, moved to that house. My brother then went to Preston Grammar School, and I needed a school, and there was a school round the corner called St Mark's, and it was a traditional church school. And she took me there, and they enrolled me, and I would be about 13 years old then. And I was very fortunate that there was a headmaster there called Mr Waddington, who I found later on in life to be had a reputation for bringing children on and being an excellent head teacher, and he really was. And he picked up my interest in astronomy with talking in the class during science lessons, and he made arrangements for me to become a member of the Preston Astronomical Society, which was a...
Taught me that one.
Right, I've gone through all that lot.
Yeah.
Right, but that got us, because I was thinking, I've not told you how we got to Preston. When we started school, the war had begun, and there was a shortage of leather. But what was very popular within the mills was clogs. These were made of wood, very similar to Dutch clog, but not moulded, made of wood. And the upper was very thick leather, and it had like a cord through it. But on the clogs themselves, they put metal rings. They put a ring on the heel and a ring on the toes. And we used to go along kicking the road to make sparks. The problem was it made the irons come off the clogs. So we then, the most popular place to get them repaired was at a place called Willie Ashton's. Willie Ashton was a cobbler who spent many years repairing clogs. And they had a small hut in 7 stars. And in this hut, it didn't matter what time of the day you went in, there was a stove, a wood burning stove, which used to burn bits of leather. And usually in the corners, 2 old men. And quite often one of these old men used to spit, and he always missed the open fire and landed on it where it hissed and sizzled and smelled. And when you went into the shop, and there was no counter or anything. You just walked in between the leather and wrote loads and loads of old shoes, because that's what Willie used to do with the lower part of the wood when the shoes had burned, was to burn them in his stove. And he was quite a character. And what he did usually is he'd pull the iron off, or the iron was off, and then he'd put a matchstick into the hole, and then he'd put a new iron on and put the nail back into the place where it was before. But because he put a matchstick in, he didn't have to do very much work at it. And then if you paid a little extra, he would paint the clogs with a black shiny material to make it better. But if you were reasonably well off as a family, often the girls had red clogs with a brass tip on it, but they were for Sunday's best. One of the things for boys' clogs is to be careful not to just get a new pair of clogs and wear them, or else you suffered terribly, because the leather was so hard it used to take all the skin off your ankle all the way around, and you would bleed. It was very, very uncomfortable. And what you, if any sense you would do is you'd take the clogs back home and you'd put them near the fire, and that'd be at home, and you'd put on something called dubbing, and it was something which made them soft. And then you start bending them, and it was worth an hour's work to soften the clogs before wearing them, otherwise you'd suffer for weeks on end. There was a lot of farming families around Leyland, and they delivered milk, and I can remember the local milkman, he had a horse and trap just with 2 big wheels on it, and he had 2 milk churns in the back. And what you did, you went to the milk churn with a glass or a bottle, and they would actually, or a jug, and he had I think they called them a jill, and he'd dip it in and then pour the milk into the jug, and that's how people got the milk, so that they tended to get the milk, and normally you'd get about 2 jills a day. And this horse had a habit, there's no way you could put a brake on it, and when he stepped down, there was a step at the back, when he stepped onto the step to get into the milk churn, often the horse shot forward, and there was much shouting and huffing and puffing and pulling of the horse's rein, which made it more skittish, and it was quite interesting when you went in, because you knew the horse was going to skid and he was going to swear, and there'd be a lot of shouting, but it provided entertainment for the local people. The main shop in Leyland was the Co-op. Everything was bought by the Co-op. You had and when you bought stuff from the Co-op, you had a stamp. It was like it had a value, and when you had enough stamps, you could take them into the Co-op, and they would give you goods to the value of the stamps. They had a method there where the person who collected money sat up in the roof in the corner, and they had a series of wires along, and then along the counters of the shop they had a system where there was round containers which you could fasten to this ring, and you pulled a lever and it shot it up towards where the money was, and they used to look at the bills and get the correct change and shoot it back to you, but nobody handled the money apart from the person who ran the shop. And everything was through the Co-op in those days. It was a main shop in there, it was a cooperative, and it was very good value for money. In Leyland there was the River Lostock, and the River Lostock was a lovely river. It was very clean, and it was a nice river, and everybody went swimming in it in summer. It was just a common thing. In the Lostock there was loads of big black slugs, and they terrified us. And when we were swimming, somebody only to shout, "Leech, leech, a slug, slug," and everybody dived out of the water. The bank was round about 6 feet above the level of the water, and it was just about right out for diving. And generally the water was about 1 metre thick, and there was kingfishers along it. and there was also many rabbits. And I do remember a time when myxomatosis came and killed all the rabbits off, and it really upset it, because it was quite interesting. There was a couple of mills situated along the river, but they didn't pollute the river, they just used it for cooling. In Leyland, there was, at the time I can remember, there was 3 policemen, and it was run by a man called Sergeant Pollitt. And Sergeant Pollitt was a great big man, somebody to be feared. And he had what they call a sit-up and beg bike. And when he pedalled, he put the main weight on one side of it, and there was a creek. And he used to pedal through Leyland at night, and there was no lights on because of the war. But you could hear him, if you listened quietly, you could hear this noise, and it was a bit like Long John Silver about the crocodile in Peter Pan. And it was very frightening because you could hear him for a long way off. But he appeared out of the blue, and he'd get hold of you by the ear, start twisting your ear to make you behave yourself. There was no serious crime. There was odd thefts, and there was a lot of black market went on, but there was no serious crimes. There was no murders or anything like that. It was well controlled, but the death penalty was still in force then. But if anybody caused a lot of problem, any young person caused a lot of problem before they knew where they were in the army, because the philosophy was if you're not working, you hadn't got a reserved occupation, you were in the army, and they very quickly moved you into the army. So the discipline within the town was very good. The whole town was run by they weren't the mayors, but they were the lead figures in the town, and people tended to do as they were supposed to do. The odd miscreants in the town were very well known, and everybody knew the name of the families, and they were always held in scorn. Any good?
Given that it's the 75th anniversary of VE Day, what do you remember about VE Day?
Yeah. I can remember about VE Day. There was 2 days. There was one called VE Day, which was Victory in Europe, and then there was VJ Day, which people don't hear very much about, mainly because it's about the war with Japan, fought in the Pacific. But many of the people who were captured in the Pacific were from the British Army, because the colonies were out in those areas and the Japanese had overtaken the colony. But although there was a lot of celebration, then it was right in your face about Europe, because everything was to do with Europe. The one which had the most effect on people's lives was when victory of Japan took place, because all the prisoners came back and all the soldiers who'd been captured abroad, if they were still alive, came home. They had a system to look after the soldiers the best they could. They gave them 6 months leave, and then they sorted jobs out for them. But the problem was a lot of the soldiers had mental injuries. My father said that when he came back, they put a psychiatrist to look after him and another 39 officers. And he said 10 years later he saw the psychiatrist to talk to her about how things had gone, and she said that out of the 40 odd officers, almost 30 of them had committed suicide or died. She said it was a complete disaster. A lot of them could not stand being incarcerated. Is that enough for that one? I enjoyed riding a motorbike, and the Bantam 125 was a scramble bike, and there was a scramble track at Curedon Park, and it was actually used for professional scrambling. And often we used to sneak on a Sunday afternoon with my mates, and we used to ride around the track. And I can always remember one incident. There was about 9 or 10 of us going around the track. And I could manage all right, provided I leaned left, but I couldn't manage if I leaned right because I fell over. But I was managing to get around the track, and then the blue boy had joined us, and he got a nice posh scramble bike. But he wasn't very good at scrambling because he hadn't done very much. And we went ahead, and then we went round over a bank and swung down the side of the bank and swung left, and then waiting for him to come. And below the bank there was quite a deep pond, and we saw him come over the top, and he spotted us, and then we saw what he was doing, and he swung towards us, and he came straight towards us towards the end of the bank, and he took off into space, and we thought he's dead, and he hit the water, and he shot forward, and he skated over the top of the water. His bike stopped there, and then he went, and we then went to get him out, and we had a heck of a job dragging this beautiful new bike out, covered in mud, and then to send it into the motorbike repairer, who to take it to pieces and take the engine, because he virtually damaged it, ruined it completely. There was another boy there, which I mentioned before, and he, because we were a little bit wild, he went racing down Fishergate Hill, and he went trying to go round the big roundabout, which was the bottom, and he swung right to go over the river, and he didn't make it, and he ran into his fence and about 20 foot of iron railing, and he was killed instantly. This sort of thing went on quite a lot with boys in those days, and it was probably one of the main reasons and caused the death in young boys. There was another friend whose brother got a motorbike, and he was driving it from Leyland to Lostercall, and there used to be what they call Leyland Lock. And he got on some cobbles, and he'd got a guy in the back. They ran straight into the front of a bus, and they were both killed instantly. And he left a wife and 2 children. But we settled down, as we got older, we settled down, and I got a bigger bike. I got a 250, which is okay. But my real top bike was a Visa 650 PS. It was a very large bike, and we had
Super Rocket.
Super Rocket, and we had a sidecar on it, and we used to take the family. There was Dorothy, my wife then, and the 2 children in the sidecar, and I drove it. And I can remember once driving from Leicester to Christchurch, and it was a 9-hour drive, and with a motorbike and sidecar, the sidecar to pull left, and what you had to do is to lock your left arm. So you lock your left arm and you drove, and just doing a bit of steering with the right. And when I got there, I couldn't move my left arm for the rest of the holiday there. It was at that time, Timothy, who would be round about 18 months older, I think. About 18 months old, we'd gone on holiday. He got a fever, and we had to take him to hospital, and he was left overnight. A little one overnight though.
No, he was in for 4 days.
They were in for 4 days. And when we went to see him, he started talking, and he never stopped talking. He gambled on for maybe 1 or 2 hours, because I was so glad to see it. After the motorbike, that's that one. I then got moved around a lot at work, and they transferred me to work in London at a place called Ponder's End. And we never understood what the name was, but it was a very old factory, and it was one of the Crompton lamp works, and I was working in the lab there. We were working on lighthouse lamps and projector lamps, and the lighthouse lamps were 2,000 watts, and the projector lights were very high intensity, which is what they use for small projectors to project scenes on the walls and on screens. I enjoyed working there. It was quite interesting. I often had to go to other factories as well. We got married, and we bought what we call a masonette in Enfield, and it had got 2 bedrooms, and it was quite a nice one. And I can remember we'd been married round about 6 months, and I went out with my mates, and I brought one of them back who was a little bit drunk. And he had to be sick, he went to be sick in the toilet. I don't quite know what happened, but when he'd gone, Dorothy complained that he'd stolen the roll for the toilet. And she reminded me about that over many years. I spoke to him, and he didn't know what I was talking about, but I'm not surprised at the time. Enfield was not a nice place to live. It was handy for London. We tended to go into the city quite a lot. It was only about 20 minutes drive into the city, and there was on the Great Hartford Road there was a bus which went every night. And being in I was working as a trainee glassblower, scientific glassblower in the laboratories. One day for a man called Jim Medicroft, and I've been, let's go back, I need to go back a bit. One day, the girl from the wage office came to me, passed me a piece of paper, and I didn't know what it meant, and then she went on to give other people pieces of paper. And I opened it and there was a letter, and I didn't know what it meant. And somebody says you've been made redundant. So what do you mean we're made redundant? What's redundant? He said, well, they're cutting back on staff and you've been made redundant. And I stood there not quite knowing what to do. And then a man called Bert Austin came to see me, and he was the manager of the factory. He says, what have you got? I said, I don't know. And he took this paper out of my hand and he says, oh, leave it with me, and he put it in his top pocket. And then the foreman came across to me, says, you've got to go and see Jim Medicroft. He's across at the other factory in the laboratories, and he's in charge of the laboratories there. So I went to see him, and he said they found about my glass blowing skills, and they wanted somebody as a scientific glass blower in the laboratory, and that they'd give me a job there with an increase in salary. And I went to work there, and I worked with a guy called Bill Martin, who was a very nice bloke, and there was another guy called Frank Woodward. And I did work for the laboratory. And then he came to me, Bert Austin came again, he said, I've got you in Harris Technical College, and he says, you'll do formal glass blowing, and you'll be working for a man called Dr. Dave Evans, and you'll be assisting him, and we'll get you right through everything, Roy. And then I started going to the Harris Tech, and that's where I got my formal education, because I first studied chemistry, because that was more in line with the chemical retorts I was doing. I enjoyed myself very much in the laboratory. It was a very interesting place. I met lots of people, and there was what we call Seaman's Sports and Social Club, and we used to go to that once a week. And I'd got a motorbike by then, a BSA Bantam 125. It was only a small bike. There was other people with motorbikes there, but it was just motorbike. You either had a bicycle or you went onto a motorbike, but nobody would even consider going to a car. It was far too expensive. And there I met Dorothy, who became my wife. I don't know what else to say about that, look. We used to go into London a lot, and when people came to see us, we always went to a show, went into London. It was very handy and a good place to live, but it wasn't very good if you'd got children, because there was lots of crowds, and it was always busy. Great Hartford Road was one of the main routes in and out of London, and the buses ran all night, and some of them was trolley buses. The Ponders End factory was a nice place to work. There were nice people. It was an old building, but there was an interesting thing that on the way to the factory there was a railway crossing, and the gates used to shut when the trains were coming in. There was this main line into London. There was also a footbridge over it, and unfortunately the trains tended to come about 5 to 8, and we were supposed to start work at 8 o'clock, and there's a distance of about a quarter of a mile from the pedestrian crossing, from the railway crossing to the entrance to the factory gate, and the factory gate had got a large cast iron traditional railings on with a wheel on at the end of each gate, and there was a vertically challenged man who was the watchman there, and he used to wear a black mat and a flat cap, and the cap was very large and the mat was very big, and he disappeared in it, but he was a little bit spiteful, and he used to love the alarm going off when people hadn't arrived at the factory, so he could shut the gates. And the rule was, if he shut the gate, he couldn't shut the gate in your face, but if you shut the gate, you couldn't push the gate open, and you couldn't stop him shutting the gate for you to get through. And this had been going a long time, and there had been many complaints from the unions. But one day, the timing must have been a little bit off, because the bell went early, and the train, the gates were shut. People couldn't get across, and some went over the footbridge over the top, but there was quite a crowd behind. Then the gates opened, and he started to shut the gate, and he shut one gate, and a crowd and masses were heading towards the gate. And he'd got hold of the second gate, and he got it about half shut, with around about 60 people at the gate. They lifted the gate, and the gate moved backward, and they lifted him up, and they slammed him against the watchman's door. We never saw him again. I think he broke his leg. And after that, they stopped using the gates to keep people out. People were delighted. When I first went to London, I was very bored in the evening, because if I wasn't out in a factory somewhere dealing with different jobs, I had nothing to do. And one of the main factories I worked at, they had a theatre group, and it was a very successful theatre group. And they used to put a show on every Christmas, which was a mixture of all things. There was a ballet dancer, there was singers, there was all sorts of a little play, and it was quite successful. And they wanted somebody to do the lighting. A guy called Tony said, would I do the lighting for them? And they'd got some brand new lighting with memories, so you could set the lights up and press a button, and it would all come back at the setting like it was before. But it was quite complex, and it wasn't installed, it had to be set up. So we got this lighting, I got it all set up, and the lady who was the producer for this show, she was in her 50s somewhere, I would think, and she was very dynamic, 5 foot 2 or 3 inches. She was into everything, and she was brought by her husband, and her husband was a tall man, and a very nice and well-spoken man. And when his wife was dealing with sorting the people involved in the show around, he used to come over and ask, could he help me? And I wasn't very sure about this lighting, it was new to me, and I wasn't quite sure about the voltages being used, but I didn't want anybody to get hurt. And I wasn't sure what he was doing. And he had a habit of picking things up to ask, can he put it here or put it there? And I really wanted him away, because I was trying to sort the lighting out, and I had somebody who I thought was vulnerable. But he'd come and help, and he said, well, can I do something for you? I said, well, make me a cup of tea. So he'd make a cup of tea for himself and one for me. And this went on for several months. And we had this sort of conversation. I was trying to divert him away, and he was trying to come and help, and it was really me not spending enough time to explain it, but I was a bit nervous about this new light. I wanted to make sure it worked. Anyway, after I'd had about 7 months and the show had been put on at Christmas, the work pressure was too much, and I couldn't deal with it again for another year. And I said to him I'd have to apologise, but I'd help as much as I could, and I couldn't rely on being available. But I was trying to get somebody else to help him, and I managed to get a guy called Tony who worked in the lab, who took over from me to do it. And I said to this guy, I said, the job's okay, there's nothing to it, your background's enough to do it, but you'll have a little problem with Abraham. He tends to hang around and help a lot. I said, he's a lovely man doing his best. I said, but I find it a bit frightening because he hasn't got the electrical background and you really need to, because they're not permanent structures. When I said this, him and another guy who was stood by went quiet, and I thought, I've said something wrong, and I was trying to get the feel of what was happening. And then I said to him, do you know him? And this Tony looked at me, and they looked at each other. He said, well, do you know him? I said, no. He said, well, that's Harold Abraham. And then I found out later after that, the Harold Abraham was the one that the Chariots of Fire was written about, and he was actually a very skilled runner. no idea who I was dealing with at all. It was just the fact that somebody tried to help me. And I think it's one of my groups in life that. Okay. I was working in Leicester, living in a place called a new house in a place called Bristol, which is round about 6 miles outside Leicester. We were living at 114 Harrogate Drive, and this was a house where one of our children were born. The eldest son, Timothy, was born in Leicester Maternity Hospital, and some 18 months later, Michael was born in the house. It was a little bit unfortunate in the sense that I'd gone out to buy a suit and I was away for an hour, and when I came back, Michael was there, and Dorothy had gone into labour and got the help of the lady across the road who helped with the birth of Michael. So we now had Timothy and Michael and Dorothy at 114 Harrogate Drive, Bristol. Bristol was a nice place. It was surrounded by fields, and Dorothy got a job on the way to the housing estate that we lived on. We lived there for about 2.5 to 3 years, but I again had to go away from home, and during that period Jean's sister came to help Dorothy and live with us, give her support. I was working at many places. I went to work in Preston, I went to work back at London again, I went back to Leicester again, I then did some work up in Glasgow, and I went to Gateshead, very close to where my mother grew up, and when I used to go to meetings at Gateshead, I took a friend there who was at the same meeting, and also my mother asked could she come, and she used to sit in the back of the car and she always insisted on bringing sandwiches. So when we got halfway there, we used to have a little picnic beside the road, which my friend who I went with, who was a business acquaintance, used to love the idea of the coffee and biscuits and sandwiches and all sorts. And then I was appointed resident engineer for the factories in Preston, and there was 3 factories. There was one at Kent Street with about 1,400 people. There had been a Siemens factory with about 1,500, and then there was another factory which was a fluorescent factory with about 600 or 700, and that was one of those factories was changing from fluorescent to incandescent because the demand had gone, and I worked there for probably about 10 or 15 years. And then I was offered a job in Bucky, which is around about 400 miles north of Preston, and we had a look at it and decided that I wouldn't go there because there was no future for the boys then, because Christopher had been born by then, so we now had 3 boys, and there was no future at all at Bucky because the fishing industry had shut down and there was only one factory there, and that position was a bit dodgy, so I really didn't want to go there. So I worked in Preston, and then they decided they were going to rationalise the manufacturing in Preston. And around about the mid-1970s, I was given a job of moving machines around, and I was then travelling backwards and forwards, sorting machines out and selling some of the machines on. And then I was offered a work in Merthyr Tydfil. There was a large factory there of about 2,500 people, and I went there working to install machinery and sort it all out, and then I decided I'd had enough, and I got a job part-time working as a lecturer at what was called Chewson College then, and digital and microprocessors had just come in to the electronics then. Because I had a background in the installation of equipment like that, I was lecturing on that subject on a part-time basis. I worked like that for about 18 months, and then I was offered a job at Fleetwood college, lecturing on radios and radar systems. And it was a nice college, the Fleetwood College. What was it called? Fleetwood College.
Nautical.
Fleetwood Nautical College. There's around about 60 odd members of staff, and there's lots of students, and the idea was that either be navigation officers with a master's certificate, or there would be technical officers which looked after all the radar and the radio systems. And I worked there for a year and I quite enjoyed it, but I wasn't a very good sailor. I'd actually never been on a boat, and one day they said to me I had to take the students out to do navigation in Fleetwood Bay, and that to use a radar to decide out where they are using a thing called Marsat, which is a satellite navigation system. So I turned up in the morning with 20 students at the dockside, and there's a chap there who was called the skipper of the fishing boat which they used at Fleetwood College, and there was a ladder round about 40 feet to the level of the river below where the boat was, and I was terrified, and so I had to, with all the students, go down this ladder, and it wasn't so bad till we got about 15 feet from the water level, and then we started walking on seaweed. But I managed to get into the boat and with all the students, and off we sailed into Morecambe Bay. We got to the middle of Morecambe Bay, and the skipper of the boat turned the engines off, and he says, right, you can sort it out now. And I knew I had to give the students inside the boat, there was an array of radars and satellite navigation systems, and the students had to use them to say where we were and what to do. We kept moving around. The idea was you stay in one position, get 6 students to say where you were, and then you'd move the boat and get another 6 and go through the whole class that way. I went down with the first 6, and they'd got all the radar powered up, and they were working away, and suddenly I felt so ill. I felt terrible, and I felt like I was going to be sick, and I didn't know what had happened to me. And I staggered up onto deck, and the skipper of the boat started laughing at me, and I couldn't understand what he was laughing at because I felt terrible. And he said, oh, he says, you've not been to sea before? I said, well, no, I haven't actually. He started laughing. He said, well, it's a fishing boat, this. I said, what's that got to do with it? He said, well, it has no keel. He says, when we stop going forward, he says, it can rock in 10 directions. And I absolutely believe that. He said, we've got to move to hold the boat steady. He said, but we can't move because she's trying to do a navigational position. So I was stood up in the wind, and I was feeling a lot better. So I actually gave the lessons for all the students, looking into a black hole, telling them, yeah, that's fine, they're doing okay and everything. And then I sorted it all out afterwards. I enjoyed working at the Nautical College. The people were very nice. The subjects were interesting. I had one session where the boat had to turn over and then come back up again. And that half the road was okay. And I was the only lecturer they had who'd never been to sea, because most of them were ex-seamen of some sort or other. Either they'd been as navigation officers or else they were radio officers on the boats. I left the Nautical College. I applied for a job at Lee College, close to Manchester, and they wanted somebody with a digital background, and I went there and they gave me the job straight away, and they said I had to work for the atomic for postgraduate work with the atomic energy, with some teaching them about digital systems. And I didn't quite understand what it was, but I went along with it because the subject seemed easy enough. But what they did tell me, they were all graduates, Oxford, Cambridge and all over, and they'd all got honours degrees, and I had to teach them digital electronics. And I had 2 classes on Monday, 2 classes on Tuesday, and 1 class on Wednesday, and each of those classes were 4 hours. And then I had to have the other days to get me notes together for the students. And these students could absorb information at a tremendous rate, and I had to keep pushing the scale of what I was doing up and up and up. And I reckoned at some stages I was only about 2 hours ahead of the students with all my lectures. and then sometimes I'd actually make up the lectures out of my head using the subjects and changing the subjects because they were absorbed in the work, and I did that for 18 months. Because of the work I'd done that, it made me principal lecturer at the college, and then from that I went on to become head of engineering. And the engineering was interesting because it was trade skills and degree skills. I enjoyed the trade side because the first thing happened when I went into the classes, the staff rooms, they always give me a cup of tea and they were very friendly. And we did painting, decorating, motor vehicle repairs, building maintenance, electrical engineering, and then there was also some high level students doing diplomas in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering, and I enjoyed that job. Then after that I moved on to Wigan College, dealing with people who wanted to send people for courses and putting courses together, and I did that job for about 18 months, and then I left and I started doing international consultancy, and I worked for several companies, and I worked in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Romania, Yugoslavia, East Germany, Poland, and it was really entertaining. I also had a time in Indonesia and China, and then I retired when I was 62 years old. One of the things I can tell you about my working life was instability. Every job I went into, I was very quickly offered another job of a higher rating. I used to think it's something to do with me, but it was to do with my ability to assess situations. I'd been trained as a scientific glassblower, and when Dorothy and I got together and got engaged, Dorothy's father suggested I talk to my boss to see what my circumstances are and what the prospects were. So I went to see my boss, who was a guy called Jim Meadowcroft, who was a very intelligent and capable man. And he said that there was a director of AI lighting coming down to the factory to offer people jobs in London and at Rugby. And it would be better if I have a talk to him to see. And I met a man called, can we stop it a minute? What's his fucking name? Shit.
No.
Hang on. It starts with L. What name do you think of?
It wasn't Paul's.
Yeah. Then I met the technical director called Arthur Bowles. He was a very nice man. He interviewed me and he looked at my skills and he asked about my experience, and he said, well, we're sorting a laboratory out in London and we think you would suitably fit in. We'd like to offer you an interview in London to see if you'd gain more there because you'd get as high a salary. So arrangements were made through the personnel office to have an interview in London. I'd never been to London. I knew very, very little about it. And I can remember staying at the Strand Hotel, quite an exotic hotel in those days. And then a car picked me up in the morning, which was a bit posh for me, and took me to a site called Ponders End. And that was a large old industrial site, and they were setting up a big laboratory there for doing research. And I met a man called Leslie Bannister, who was a very nice man, and he was going to be in charge of all the research in London. And I had an interview with Les Bannister, and he became quite a close friend as time went by. And he interviewed me, and then he offered me a job. And he said, he'll sort everything out for me. So I came back and I told Dorothy, and what happened, they sorted a accommodation out, and I'd never been in digs before away from home, and I'd never really looked after myself. My mother had always looked after my needs regarding clothing and everything, because I was into motorbikes in those days, and I was more interested in being with my mates and going on motorbikes. Anyway, I went to London then, and I got the accommodation with a lady called Vera France. Is that right? Vera France. And it was a single bedroom, including food and washing of clothing, and I think it was £4 a week, or in that region. I used to catch the bus to Ponders End factory, and this Ponders End factory was a very friendly factory, but a big old industrial site. And I undertake work mainly to do with the movement of glass into projector lamps and things like that. But I'd only been at that job a few months when I was offered another job at Rugby, and I didn't want to move to Rugby, but they said, well, I could work for some people at Rugby who were coming to do work at Ponders End, and then I could take the work from there and see went through the Rugby factory. So very, very quickly I became responsible to somebody at Rugby to do the work, and they used to visit each month, and I'd look at the work and make sure it went through. So they set the work, and I followed it through for them. I then travelled on from Rugby to another factory at Brimsdown, and then one at Tottenham, and then to what they call the Lincoln Road site in Great Cambridge Road. I was all over the place on different jobs, and I seemed to be handy at being put into strange situations and being able to assess the needs of it, and my reputation was quite good, and people often rang and asked could I go and do these jobs, and I was actually doing jobs which I was never employed for, and in a way I never had a proper job. It was more or less sorting things out and fixing them, and it was very interesting. I enjoyed it. Married Dorothy a year later, and in the meantime I'd managed to sort a masonette, which is a 2-bedroom flat in Enfield, and it was quite close to Enfield Lock Railway Station, which was about 12 miles from London, and it was a thriving place, and we lived off what they call Ordnance Road. And at the bottom of Ordnance Road was a gun factory, and they made the Lee Enfield rifles there, and they also made machine guns. And a teacher Dorothy worked with, her husband actually worked as an engineer at that site, and I got interested in guns and ballistics then, and he got a rifle for me for £3, and I got a firearm certificate, and I used to go down there shooting on the range there, and I really enjoyed it very much. And I learned a lot about weapons and target shooting. But I can remember one incident that we had a covered range, and we had like sackcloth, which was made into the form of a mat, and you opened it out and stretched onto it, and then you had a range officer who made sure that you were following safety procedures, and then you lay down, and when he said go, the targets are being put back, and they're usually 25 yards and then 100 yards, and it depended on what range you wanted to go to, but you could just easily fit in. So when the range officer said shoot, you could lie down and shoot, and then he'd shout stop, and you had to unload the rifle, and you had to open the breech, and you had to indicate that there was nothing in the breech, and then they would go out and replace them. And I can remember one famous day, I'd just come late, and I'd unroll the sack and lay down, and they put the targets up. They said right, fire. Just as I pulled the trigger, I got a terrible pain in my ankle. It was a terrible pain, it really hurt, and I thought I'd been shot. Somebody shot me, and then I thought it's my ankle, it'll be damaged, I'll have to have a plaster on it. I had all this in my head, and I turned over gently without making a fuss. I unloaded my rifle, I rolled my trouser leg up, and I was delighted to see this wasp crawling down my sock, and I could feel the relief come over me. So there must have been a wasp into this sock, and that was the only thing like that would happen. When we got married, we moved into this masonette, and the masonette was nice. It was a downstairs masonette. And there was a guy called Jeff and Pat lived upstairs, and he'd been a joiner for the co-op, and because joinery had been reduced because they used to make coffins, the coffins were bought, and what they did was to French polish them and put the handles on, so the work was reduced. And the chap next door was also a joiner who did on a similar job. And what these two had been transferred to his actual burials, and what they did was to carry the coffins. So they got the coffins, were brought in, they polished them, they put the handles on and the lids, and then they joined the group of 6 people who carried the coffins. And usually there was a leader of the procession, which is a member of the co-op, and he organised the coffins being carried, and then they got the vicar. These 2 guys were comedians in every sense of the word. And I don't think they'd enough to do, but one of the things they did is they also had a coal depot at the co-op, and they always brought home enough coal in a bag over the crossbar of the bike to keep them going the next day. So in winter, I don't think they ever bought any coal. They brought enough home. And then they had an idea coming up to after November the 5th, and they got some big plastic bags which they used at the dry cleaners, and they used to fill them with gas and tie a firework on the bottom and light it and let it go up. And then suddenly it would explode, and people would look up, and you see this big ball of flames, and they were doing it to such an extent it went in the paper, and they were talking about UFOs and things like that, till the boss caught on what was happening, and he told them he'd fire them if they didn't stop it. So they stopped that. One day I was doing some gardening, and it was a summer's evening, and they said, and I talked about the Rolls Royce, because they used to drive the Rolls Royce they had. It was a beautiful car, and they said, do you want to ride in the Rolls Royce? We're just going to get it now. And they tended to work in pairs. And what they to do is that when people died, often people wanted the body taken away to be held in the morgue, and they used to go and collect it with a Rolls Royce. But they didn't tell me this. They just said, we're getting the Rolls Royce out to go for a ride. So I said, yeah, I'd like one. And then when it came, they said, well, you'll have to sit in the back. And there's a seat in the back of the Rolls Royce where the coffin, close to where the coffins were in a settlement. They set off. Unfortunately, the back of the car was a long car, used to bounce up and down, and I was bouncing up and down. We set off and we left London and went into the countryside. And these 2 were singing away, and I was banging on the side of the car, asking them where we were going and what we were doing. They said, don't worry. Then they stopped in a country lane, and it was getting dark then. And they said, we won't be so long, and they set off. About quarter an hour later, I'm in this country lane, in the dark, wondering what's going on. Then I heard a lot of puffing and panting, and then these 2 came out carrying a coffin, and they lifted the back up and they pushed it underneath where the coffins usually are in the back of a car. It's on the top, but they're actually underneath it. There's a place you can put spare coffins, and they pushed it into there. I said, what are you doing? They said, well, we're to pick this lady up. He said, if she tries to get out, push her down again, because we don't like people wandering around at the back. He said, because they're usually dead by then. And they brought me back again. And they really were comedians. One day they built a shed, both of them built, well, Jeff did, and he built a garage in his garden. And then he said, when they'd done, they were very kind. They said, do you want a shed? I said, well, I can't afford one. He said, oh no, don't worry, we'll sort it out. And the next day I came home from work, there was a load of wood in the garden. And they said, oh, we put that wood there, it's for your shed. And then the pair of them set to, and they did concrete, and they built me a shed in the garden, which I thought was very, very kind. And they wouldn't take any money. And I said, well, what about the cost of the wood? And then I found out several months later, and in fact, they were knocking some houses down, and the people were piling the wood up. The people were knocking houses to sell on, and they turned up with this lorry, piled the wood into it, and the policeman had come past and said to him, you're working late? He said, yes, we are, we just got to get this job done. and that's where the wood came from. And I became a bit nervous of these two because the next they had the chain link fence all around the garden, and they said, would you like some chain link fence? And like a fool I said, yes, that'd be nice. And a guy called Johnny came and he put it up and he put all the chain link fence right down my garden around it. It was very nice. And he only charged me £1 a reel, which I thought was a bit cheap. And it was only then that I found out that in actual fact his job was installing chain link fencing. What he used to do, he used to pull it tight, and if he pulled it the right tension, you couldn't notice it, and he could gain an extra, for every 10 rolls he could gain an extra roll for nothing, and he used to sell that on. So they were comedians in their own way, but they were very kind and generous people. And then after, and I was moving around a lot again, and then I was doing a lot of work around Lancashire and some places in Manchester as well. And I kept coming back to Preston to do jobs in the 3 factories there. And they said, we'd like you to move as a resident engineer into the northwest. And I said, what will I be doing? They said, well, they will be doing technical work for Leicester, because, wrong thing. We lived in London and I'd started doing work in Leicester. And they were building a new lab there, and they asked me would I move to Leicester in this new lab. I asked them what I'd be doing. They said you'd be doing technical work in the various factories and also some work in the northwest and London as well. So we sold the house in Enfield, and we actually went, we'd been to the sales people and we put the house on the market, and by the time we got home, how many people was it there?
About 6.
There were 6 people waited to buy the house. We actually sold the house within 20 minutes of putting it on the market. And then we moved to Leicester. And in Leicester we went to a house called 114 Harrogate Drive. Now I think I've talked about it from there. Right. We went to 114 Harrogate Drive, which is a place called Bristol. And it was a nice house, it was quite a big one. And it was a new estate of about 1,000 houses, and it was, unfortunately, it was at the top of a hill. And at those times there was no bus through the estate. But if you walked down to the bottom you could catch a bus. But there were several people on the estate who worked in the same laboratory I did, and they gave me lifts into work. And in fact, Dorothy's friend's brother from Preston was working there, and he lived in a house just round the corner. I then had a little moped which I used, and it was smashing to go to work because it was about 6 miles to work, and I used this moped. And then I went out. I did that for a couple of years, but again I was travelling a lot. I was away from home all the time, going on jobs to do with mainly manufacturing processes at the various factories, and applying a new technical technique in factories and updating machines. So I travelled quite a lot. And at the 114 Devonshire Road, Dorothy Bickett was pregnant, and later Tim was born in the hospital in Leicester City. He came home and we went to the church, and he was christened at Birstall Church. Most of the family came down, and then we actually went to that church. That was the local church we went to. And I still did a lot of travelling. I was away quite a lot. And Dorothy became pregnant again. During that time, I'd got extensive work away in Preston, and in Leicester, and in London. And Jean came to stay with Dorothy to keep her company. We take it better from there, can't you?